This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. Improving media literacy is seen as an important part of the battle against the spread of disinformation online. But we need to make sure users have the tools they need to navigate their way through a sea of plausibly presented fake news. I'm Damian Collins, and in this podcast, I'll be discussing this issue with representatives from two organisations that are doing just that. First, we'll hear from Andy Parsons, Director of the Adobe Content Authenticity Initiative, and then Anna-Sophie Harling, Managing Director Europe of NewsGuard, an organisation which publishes trust ratings for over 6,000 websites produced by real journalists. We'll also be hearing from our resident expert, the disinformation analyst Charles Creel. Andy Parsons, it's great to have you with us here on the Infotagion podcast. We've spoken quite a lot in the past about the problems of deepfake technology presenting fake images to people. We've seen incidents of disinformation campaigns using images claiming to be one thing, but there are in fact something completely different. We're familiar with the fact that after accidents or terrorist attacks, often the internet is flooded with pictures that are supposedly from that location, but actually could be many years old and taken in a different context. So it's interesting to discuss today how we can go about addressing that. And I was very interested to hear about Adobe's work on the Content Authenticity Initiative to create sort of technology tools that help us identify real images from the fakes. And I thought perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that.
My pleasure, Damian. Thank you for having me. It's a very timely discussion to be having. I know your podcast often focuses on the problems that we're facing, so it's refreshing to talk about some of the solutions here today. The Content Authenticity Initiative is an Adobe-led initiative that was started in 2019, announced at Adobe's Max conference, which is our big creative professional conference that happens every year. And it was founded in concert with the New York Times and Twitter. The idea being to study kind of where Adobe could help promote responsible use of AI-driven and very sophisticated tools for creativity. But very quickly in those early days, it became clear that the solutions towards provenance, which I'll describe in a moment, that help creators gain attribution for their work and also kind of prove what it is and its origin are the same solutions that can help with misinformation and disinformation. So the underlying technical idea is we asked ourselves, could we focus rather than detecting what's false sort of post hoc, where a lot of interesting research has been done, could we instead turn our attention to proving what is true and the veracity of how something was created, who created it, as you pointed out, where a photographer might have been standing at the time that something was created. And this is especially germane to news content for obvious reasons. We discovered that there are existing standards that can be sort of brought together in novel ways to accomplish this idea of provenance, which really, at its simplest level, is the idea of showing where something came from. So the word provenance from the art world, of course, meaning the entire ownership chain, dating all the way back to the origin of the piece itself. And we think the same ideas apply to news content and creative content, where if you can expose transparency to media consumers that helps inform them where something came from, who made it, who vouches for it in the case of a news source, that we know from some of the research we've done that consumers would embrace tools like that. We know in the UK, for example, we sponsored some research that told us that 73% of consumers support and are excited for increased access to information about where something came from. 67 or so percent of professional creators and consumers are very concerned that media they see every day is likely to be fake or untrustworthy, even if it comes from people that they know. So in short, we feel that this idea of provenance, which the CAI is promoting and building, addresses that idea of providing transparency to consumers about what something is and where it came from.
So for the consumer's point of view, they can easily see using this tool. They can click a link which will show where this was originated from, and also I believe if any editing has taken place or any manipulation of that image, it can tell you who's done that and where as well.
That's right. Yeah. So even things as innocuous as, a social media site resizing or cropping an image for display purposes would be part of that chain of provenance. And I use the word chain very deliberately here. The idea is that, in CAI parlance, content authenticity sort of vernacular, the idea of a claim is a cryptographically sealed bit of information that travels with an image, is inextricably attached to it, also is tamper evident, meaning if anyone tries to subvert the idea, then user interfaces on social media, news sites, what have you, Photoshop, other tools would know that something had been tampered with and altered. And that's done through a sequence of cryptographic hashing and digital signatures. And yeah, the idea is absolutely that if you follow the chain back, you'll see every edit. This is also very privacy concerned. I should mention privacy is a first class concern of ours in the design of the system. So if a creator or a news organization wishes not to share things for issues of privacy for creators, or perhaps issues of safety for those that might be depicted in a photo or video, those affordances are made as well. But with full transparency turned on, you would see, as you indicated, every edit, every change, however innocuous it might be, without judgment. The idea behind these tools is not to judge whether something is real or fake, but present verifiably true data about images and video to consumers.
And I suppose the good thing about tools like this is that whilst this works for images that have been created since the tool has been created, people would know, looking for pictures of contemporary events or current events, that if that image doesn't have this sort of embedded behind it, then that might suggest, it doesn't tell you that it's not true, but it doesn't give you that extra level of security that you know that this definitely is what it claims to be.
Yeah, that is definitely true, Damian. We don't expect to engender a universe where suddenly every camera and every news organization has CAI-enabled images and videos. And in fact, there is a method we have in mind that we're testing in Adobe Stock, our own stock agency with some editorial content, that would allow news agencies and collections of folks who run collections of images to retroactively imbue those images with CAI security. And the idea would be, for example, BBC is a partner of ours. If the BBC wishes to prove that its content, whether it's current events, new, or even legacy content, came from the BBC, they can retroactively, effectively stamp what we call a vouching claim, meaning that if you trust the BBC as delivering you your news, then maybe you trust that the BBC vets its photographers and creators of content. And therefore, as long as it came from the BBC and that is provable, then you can trust the content retroactively.
And actually, it's an interesting point there. I think it's good that you can do that, so that older images can be stamped in the same way. But how do you make sure people aren't gaming the system?
That's a good question. Again, we're trying to indicate what is verifiably true. So in this case, we can't go much further than verifying that the BBC, using cryptographic signatures, has in fact vouched for a particular image. And again, trust is sort of, in addition to the mathematical provability of cryptography, the ideas underlying the CAI depend heavily on trust. And trust is a much more difficult to define, challenging concept. It might, in the case of fact checkers, deal with reputation of the individual fact checker, certainly the reputation of the news source. But again, if you trust the party that's delivering your news or your content, then it is reasonable that you would trust the methods that are used for verifying the metadata. So if the BBC were to do what I described, we would trust as BBC consumers that they had vetted photographers and the metadata associated with that image. But you're right; there's no guarantee that is the case.
And I mean, you mentioned the BBC, a partner with yours. I mean, has this been a bit of interest to other companies, particularly the big photo agencies like the Press Association and Reuters?
Absolutely. So I hope we get a chance later in the podcast to talk a little bit about a project that was done with the CAI, Stanford, Adobe, and Reuters that sort of proves out these ideas in a very interesting prototype around the US election. But there are many companies interested in what we're doing. Just yesterday, this week, we announced the C2PA, which is a Linux Foundation project, a fully open standards creation body that the CAI and something called Project Origin are liaising with to sort of bring together provenance approaches that have focused on news, but also on creative content, and have a marriage of those two ideas in this standards body. And it was founded by Adobe, the BBC, Microsoft, ARM, Intel, TruePic, and others. And we expect that to be the place where these ideas are sort of fomented into adoptable standards. So lots of interest from publishers. I think you'll see folks like you described joining both the initiative and the standards as we move forward with it.
Obviously, it's been a big news year in America in particular, with the election and the extraordinary events between the election day and President Biden's inauguration. But has this new technology been deployed effectively during that period of time, and to help verify images, particularly of incidents like the insurrection in Washington in January?
Yeah, so it's early days for us. It's very clear to me and to the folks behind the CAI, both at Adobe and our partner companies, that this kind of technology, although it has not benefited consumers looking for news around the U.S. election, that as we look to the future, this is something that is close to reality, closer than many folks think. And when you look at how many standards are created and adopted, it can be a multi-year, sometimes a decades-long process. What we intend here at Inception is to build a broad spectrum of partnerships so that we can make sure we don't preclude any use cases, whether it's streaming media or social media scale or things of that nature. That we sort of future-proof this, and that it will be available to consumers within the next couple of years, rather than the typical standards-based approach to deploying such things that could take much, much longer. So, while the CAI concepts have been around for a couple of years, and the idea of provenance dating back, many, many more years, they have not been effective simply because they're not widely deployed yet. But we do feel, perhaps in time for the UK elections, that they will be widely available, at least to cement the idea of trust around news providers, if not the entire provenance chain back to creation and involvement in hardware like cameras and camera phones. But we've tried very hard to not only build the standards, write white papers, and talk about how the techniques will be applied, but to actually show in reality through prototypes that this is possible. So if you go to our website, contentauthenticity.org, you can look at a case study where a photographer was outfitted with a device that has the CAI technology built into it. It was a prototype device that Qualcomm supplied us. You can see how those images could be taken on the camera, brought into Photoshop or other tools, then published on the New York Times and eventually shared on Twitter, all while maintaining that cryptographic data that provides transparency to consumers. So it's not here yet, but we feel it's very close and imminent.
Do you see this as being a tool, like other Adobe products, that in the future any citizen could use, or will it be principally a media tool?
No, it's for anyone. So we have in mind that the idea behind open standards and standards that have no intellectual property, fully open. One of our guiding principles, in fact, is accessibility, which is a twofold concept. One is accessibility, of course, to consumers, so that the transparency is carried through the chain all the way to the end viewer, but also transparency in terms of adopters and implementers. So, we know that small news organizations, for example, or small development teams building creative tools don't necessarily have the access to large engineering teams that we have, or that perhaps the BBC or the New York Times have. And therefore, the technology has to be eminently adoptable and simple through open source and tools that we will help provide through the standards organization that will help people adopt this and build it in. There are no limitations on where it can exist. I think the most obvious kind of low-hanging fruit where it can be helpful is around giving creators attribution for their work. So, if I made something, I can get credit for it. And secondly, of course, in the misinformation, disinformation space. But we do expect many other creative uses that I wouldn't purport to know or anticipate. We expect businesses to be built around the ideas of the CAI, and at least for the CAI tools and the open source code that we'll provide to be used to build these businesses and see ever more innovative ideas coming out of it.
Great. I think it's a really exciting development in helping us to deal with, I think, what's going to be an increasingly big problem of falsified and fake images and film circulating as supposedly the real thing. But Anna-Sophie, it's great to have you with us on the podcast as well. I'd really like to talk about the work that NewsGuard is doing in a different way to try and give people the tools that they need to navigate their way through the content we see online. Media literacy is an important part of how we solve the problem of disinformation on social media. But for media literacy to work, we've got to give users tools that they can easily use and identify as well. So they can more readily identify a fake news source from a real news source. And as we know, that without those sorts of tools and indicators, that can be quite difficult for people. So perhaps for the benefit of listeners who are not familiar with NewsGuard, you could tell us a little bit about how you go about your work to identify trusted news sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I am a longtime fan. So NewsGuard was founded really on the idea of user empowerment. We are a team of journalists that thought that we would create a tool to help users distinguish between credible sources of information and purveyors of disinformation by giving those users a sense of who is behind the website, how are they funded, what are their editorial practices, if any, and do they have any ulterior motives or political agendas that the user should be aware of. So we created 9 criteria of credibility and transparency. They range from things like, has the website been repeatedly flagged by fact-checking organizations? Do they have a corrections policy? What even is a corrections policy and why is it important? Do they differentiate between news and opinion responsibly? Are headlines misleading? And then on the transparency side, things like, are advertising and sponsored content clearly labeled? Do they provide information about ownership and financing? And how can users get in touch with the website? So with these 9 criteria, we provide an overall rating of credibility for the website. And then crucially, we write up what we call a nutrition label for each website that we rate that explains to the user how we came up with the rating, what we found when we investigated the website, that allows users to read through for themselves and decide whether or not it's a website that they want to read, share, like, or trust with their family. And the idea really there is, rather than blocking any type of content or saying, this is good, this is bad, we wanted to give people the tools to think critically about the sources they encounter online in a way that hasn't really been done before. Fact-checking is at the claim level, but similar to the Adobe project, we really focus at empowering people at the source level.
And so with your 9 criteria, do you think it's easy to say, okay, there are organizations that fail to provide information against these criteria are likely to be disinformation news sources, in that disinformation news sources tend to be more obscure about where they're based, who works for them, if anyone, and who owns them?
Yeah, I think there's a general pattern that when websites don't disclose who runs them, if they're anonymously run, they tend to have poor credibility standards as a result. As part of our ratings process, we reach out to websites for comment if they fail any one of our 9 criteria. And so we are regularly engaged with websites who might not disclose those types of information. And because of our ratings process, we actually find that a lot of websites change their transparency practices in order to get a higher NewsGuard rating. So we've seen websites ranging from, what we would consider to be disinformation websites all the way through to highly credible websites that were made aware of the fact, for example, that there was no information about how the website was financed, or, for example, that their labeling of advertising was inconsistent across the website. And they might change that as a result of our ratings process because it is so interactive with news sites. And I think that's an important point because right now, every single tech platform has its own internal ratings system for news websites. It's just that is entirely opaque, and websites don't know how or why they can change that rating. So we think it's really important to bring greater transparency, not just towards users, but also towards newsrooms about why it is that certain types of content get elevated or promoted above others.
And I think that's right. I think it is opaque, the way in which the platforms do choose to do that. And I think the suspicion would be that their methods are based more on engagement than accuracy, and therefore if lots of people are talking about a piece of content, it must be something worth promoting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that NewsGuard really thinks about it is that we would encourage both the platforms or any upcoming regulators to think about creating a kind of industry for tools, whether it's like the Adobe tool or NewsGuard or many others, that would allow the end user to pick and choose for themselves the kind of information ecosystem they'd like to create. So one could imagine that alongside NewsGuard, they would have the option to look at other sources for information vetting or reliability, and ideally also be able to have greater control over why it is they're seeing certain types of content or why recommendation features are pushing them towards certain types of groups or pages. So really when we think about, user empowerment and media literacy, it really comes back to greater control over the ecosystem, greater critical thinking, greater access to a diversity of news sources. So one thing that NewsGuard users say is that because they have information about sources that they're encountering online, they're able to make more educated choices about which sources of news they'd like to use beyond those that they know. So you end up consuming more local news, more digital first, more up-and-coming news sources. And through their nutrition labels, just have a better overall information diet.
I mean, and with your process, how do you deal with foreign media, particularly media based in hard-to-get-to jurisdictions, and how do you engage with them on the ratings that you give them?
So we currently operate in the UK, US, Italy, France, and Germany. We're strongly considering expanding to a range of jurisdictions, but it largely will depend on, I guess, where the demand is. In the countries where we currently operate, we take data that looks at over a 90-day period which websites get the most engagement across social media in that country. And so it tends to be, in Germany, for example, you'll have predominantly German news sources, but there will be some Austrian, some Swiss, of course, some US, UK, French caught up in there. But with a news outlet like, for example, RT or Sputnik or Al Jazeera, we will rate them along those same 9 criteria. And we might, for example, compare the BBC charter to the editorial independence that an Al Jazeera or an RT might have from a state in order to determine whether or not, for example, they would, quote unquote, gather and present information responsibly as per our 9 criteria, or whether they separate news and opinion responsibly in a way that doesn't covertly further the agenda of a state.
At the heart of this, I think, is a really interesting question that is going to be really important when the online harms bill comes to Parliament in the UK, because the UK government has said that it wants to carve out an exemption for news organisations from the online harms regulation. That begs the question: is how do you define what a news organisation is? I think we'd all feel that we can recognise when we see one, but if you're working with quite a big breadth of organisations, how do you determine where the edge is between an organisation that claims to be a news organisation but is really a propaganda outfit, or has a very informal way of working, which would be considered probably below the standards of a normal news organisation?
Absolutely, I think that's one of the big issues with the upcoming bill, and we'll definitely keep an eye on that. I mean, if you think about, even when you say it's easy for us to determine what is a news site and what isn't, a couple of election cycles ago in the US, the article in a website named the Denver Guardian that said that the Pope had endorsed Trump ended up getting an extremely outsized amount of engagement across social media. And the Denver Guardian looked like a credible news site. It had, weather and local sports scores and loads of other articles, but it was, an entirely fake website that was created really to get money off of advertising revenue, which is what we see a lot. And the question there is, who would have been able to catch that was not a real news source? Equally, about April of last year, a website that we had rated red published an article saying that Bill Gates was going to profit off of a future vaccine for COVID and that he was likely going to be injecting people with microchips. This was, almost a year ago, well before there was any vaccine rollout. And that ended up being one of the most engaged articles around vaccines even in the last year. So that was sort of sowing the seeds early. And the question is, would that have fallen under that exemption? Who would have caught that? Who's making that decision and on what terms? And one would hope that if they're relying on a variety of different sources to help make those decisions, that is being done in an extremely transparent manner.
I think that's right, because some of the worst offenders in terms of spreading harmful disinformation are often organisations that set themselves up to be news organisations. And we've seen plenty of research looking at Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members that have been set up principally to amplify content from websites where disinformation is being generated. And indeed, during the American presidential election, during the period, the last couple of weeks of the campaign when advertising was restricted, some campaign groups set themselves up as news organizations so they could continue to put out ads. And I think do you think it's going to be possible to create a way of determining what a news organization is or not, unless there's some degree of human moderation?
Oh, there has to be human moderation. I think, we had briefly chatted about this, but if you look at what happened last week with Facebook's reaction to proposed Australian legislation that might make them pay for linked news content, they blocked all Australian news content, and because I think it wasn't purely human moderation, they ended up taking down all sorts of types of content that wasn't even meant to be included in that ban, including, for example, public health sources in the middle of a pandemic and a vaccine rollout. And international news sources were affected. And I think that was because that was sort of done overnight without human moderation in one fell swoop. And the real question is, if there aren't humans making those decisions, and if those decisions crucially aren't being made in a manner that is transparent to governments, regulators, users, and ultimately the news outlets, who is going to suffer from that? Because it won't be Facebook.
Right. If I can just jump in on this, I think this topic is really the nexus of sort of the cryptographic verification that the CAI is putting forth, and the good work that Anna-Sophie and NewsGuard are doing. Because, not only does the classification of a news source as news, which I fully agree is a very subjective, human-centric decision to be made, doesn't only affect what content appears on platforms, but it can also affect how those bits of content are treated. For example, with the ubiquity of something like provenance through the Content Authenticity Initiative, we would expect platforms to not artificially amplify things that don't have authenticity data or provenance connected to them. Or for users to be able to say, look, I'm in news mode, I'm consuming news on my platform of choice. I choose to filter out things that don't have authenticity data because they're likely to be fake. They're more likely to be faked or disinformation oriented than other things. So I think classifying, what is a news context on a social media platform? How do we know that someone is consuming news? And more importantly, as you pointed out, Damian, what exactly is news can actually flip a bunch of switches in the way that content is promoted or amplified or even shown or not shown. And this is where these techniques of provenance and human judgment, I think, meet and will be absolutely essential.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, as you both suggested, that what we probably, it'd be an interesting question to say, should social media users have the right to be able to adjust their settings so that they see less content that doesn't have some authenticity data behind it, either that it's been, if it's a news organization, it's had a positive rating from NewsGuard, or if it's an image, that it's one that's been verified by independent tools.
That's right, and that will require ongoing work between our two organizations and many others to make sure that these technologies and human beings are fully compatible. It extends to ideas that we contemplate often and are thinking through right now on the standard side, which is there are cases where you want to imbue reputation and trust into the cryptographically verifiable data. Best example is fact checking, which I mentioned earlier. So there are early standards, things like claim review, that provide sort of a text-based standard way of involving fact checks in the metadata that is associated with image. But in the absence of a rating or trustworthiness of the fact checker, the news organization, it's just more noise and more data. So I really think the marriage of these kind of human judgments and ratings, which of course is an ongoing, constant matter of looking at websites and the content they publish, married with the idea of sort of provenance data that can involve fact checking, gives the consumers the ability to effectively judge for themselves whether to trust something or not.
Yeah, I think if I can quickly jump in,
yeah, of course.
Sort of figuring out ways to use human intelligence as a seed for artificial intelligence is also something that we've been thinking about quite a bit at NewsGuard. We recently developed something called Misinformation Fingerprints, which is a database of the major false claims and conspiracies that we see trending across the websites that we've rated red. And we've written those up into a machine-readable format and worked with a couple of AI companies who've taken that to, for example, figure out the earliest instance of where that claim appeared online. And it was actually the one that we'd used was a Chinese disinformation website. Another AI company used one of the fingerprints to figure out where across various tech platforms that claim had appeared, even when it wasn't necessarily linked to a website that we'd rated. So, keeping in mind and very conscious of the fact that the internet is, it's not just scaling at, it's scaling rapidly, but it's also doing it so quickly that the only way really to keep up from a moderation standpoint is to find a way to marry human intelligence and artificial intelligence. But when we think about what we're showing users, you do have to also keep in mind what is it from a user perspective that is not just sort of tried and tested, but is also research backed in terms of figuring out what are the tools that really stimulate media literacy while at the same time encouraging people to access all sorts of types of content.
And Andy and Anna-Sophie, what sort of discussions have you had with some of the big social media companies about whether they will be open to incorporating products like this into their systems?
So our major partner is Microsoft. Brad Smith is a big fan of NewsGuard, and he encouraged his Defending Democracy program to welcome us in a couple of years ago when they first launched it. So we're sitting alongside something called Election Guard and Account Guard. And Microsoft has integrated our ratings into their Edge mobile browser. So people can opt into a news rating feature if they so wish to and see our icons and labels when they go on certain websites. So that's one way in which they've worked with us. We're also working with a couple of other parts of the company to figure out ways to use NewsGuard's data that make sense across a variety of products. But of course, they're not really the big social companies. When we think about the bigger platforms like Google, Facebook, and maybe Twitter as well, I would say those conversations are ongoing. A lot of platforms are determined to build solutions like this in-house. And I think one of the reasons why we're quite encouraged by some of the movement that's happened over the last year is that we see that various governments and regulators are pushing platforms to try to work more actively and interdependently with local safety tech communities that exist in each country, who can help do some of the heavy lifting, but also operate in a way that really is ultimately more transparent towards users. Ideally, you would have, as I said, sort of a safety tech community that is competitive, presents multiple different solutions towards users so that people can pick and choose which sorts of tools they'd like to see in their social media feeds and search results. And there are a couple of smaller platforms that we're working with as well, which has been extremely rewarding and quite interesting.
Yeah, and on our side, Damian, it won't surprise you to know that we have also ongoing conversations with all the big platforms. I think there's a sort of who's going to go first dynamic at work here. I also think that the platforms are still recovering from a hangover, if you will, from the US election. And going into the election, because there weren't sort of robust, standardized, scalable provenance tools available at the time, and there will be, that's what we're focused on, there was a heavy focus on detection. So the idea of post hoc artificial intelligence to detect, based on signals and images and videos, what might be fake, and then have human interventions to actually make decisions about news. That's antithetical to the velocity at which news moves and the velocity with which social media users share that news. So we feel at the end of the day, that's probably an arms race that is likely unwinnable, meaning the bad guys have access to all the open source tools that the good guys are producing. And over time, just like Hollywood special effects, sort of matured to such a degree that what you see on screens in 3D is virtually indistinguishable from reality. We think that democratized, easy to access consumer level tools will be able to do the same thing in short order. And because of that, we see the platforms turning their attention to provenance, again, trying to prove where something came from, what its origins are, rather than trying to detect systematically through AI whether or not it is fake. So I think as part of our initiative and the standards work we're doing, you'll see platforms joining the effort. Those conversations are ongoing. And as I mentioned earlier, we have worked with Twitter from the very beginning at the inception of the content authenticity work.
I think will become an interesting question for regulatory models as well, because obviously, as we discussed already, in the UK, there is the online harms legislation. In America, in Europe rather, there is the Digital Services Act. And both those pieces of legislation really seek to impose some sort of standards on the companies over the content that they remove when it's harmful and illegal, and how effective they are at doing that. But I don't think this debate is just about individual pieces of content that someone has posted, and therefore there's a debate about whether that should be allowed to stay up or not. The most powerful part of social media are the recommendation tools that are built in it to build engagement and keep people on the site. And therefore, I think it becomes an interesting question for the companies and for the regulators that will be set up to oversee this legislation to say, well, if you're recommending something to users, are you sure that this is content that can be trusted and is authentic, or is it harmful? And what systems do you have in place to try and make judgments about what content you're prepared to amplify or not? Or do you have none? And it's simply a question of the stuff that is trending trends even further.
Yeah, I think it's important that any type of regulatory regime doesn't focus on specific pieces of content or trying to combat individual types of content, but rather looks at, as you say, really a systems-based approach. So the platform design. And when we look at something like anti-vaccine misinformation, the problem isn't so much that anti-vaccine sentiment exists somewhere on Facebook. It's more that the way that the platform is set up right now, and as you, Damian, mentioned, because it really seems to be based around engagement rather than veracity or quality of content, you do see situations in which, and this is, I have a fake Facebook account that I use to investigate exactly these topics, is when you join an anti-lockdown group, you'll get suggested to go to a anti-mask group, which pushes you to a COVID is a hoax group, and soon you're in a massive anti-vax group. And once you're in that, Facebook will see that you enjoy spending time there, and it'll suggest 5 more anti-vax groups for you to join. And soon you're surrounded by it, and it's completely possible to see a world in which someone can live in an entirely alternate information ecosystem, in a world that is shaped entirely by what they're seeing on social media and what those recommendation systems are suggesting they spend time on.
Yeah, I agree. And Anna-Sophie mentioned scale earlier. I think, human beings just cannot scale to the degree, the number, the velocity of content sharing. And furthermore, this is all exacerbated by what we all well know. And I think many research projects have shown over and over again that human beings on social media tend to share things that fit their worldview. Sometimes without even reading an article or really looking at an image or watching a video. In fact, there's what I would call a speed bump that Twitter has been experimenting with, where if you go to share something that you haven't read, effectively a link that you haven't clicked, there'll be a little intervention that says, hey, are you sure you want to share this? You haven't read it. You want to read it? And we know, based on our work with many of the platforms and research that we've seen and conducted ourselves, that many people will, blow right past that and share anyway. So I think this idea of amplification that fits people's worldviews and is sort of self-reinforcing is at the crux of the problem. It's not the only part of the problem, but certainly when it comes to sharing platforms, it exacerbates what's already a problem of disinformation. And this is where we think that provenance data and authenticity can help if platforms would commit. And I'm not in any way advocating this be part of legislation, but should legislation in this area come to exist, we would like folks to think about provenance and reach for standards like the CAI in order to make it real. And one thing I want to make sure is clear here is that we're not opposed to AI and machine learning for helping regulate content at scale, or helping moderate content at scale, I should say. But we think that provenance signals can help that process. Again, if something is in news mode, consumers tend to consume it in news mode, and it's missing authenticity provenance data. Maybe it's not eligible for the sort of amplification that other kinds of sharing news pieces of content get. Those kinds of things can inform ML algorithms, which tend to be opaque, with the transparency of provenance. And we hope that is where this heads.
I think that's right. I think it is important because, as we all know, there are organisations set up to game the algorithms of social media to artificially boost content with, if you like, inauthentic engagement from fake accounts and so on. And what we wouldn't want to see is that the response of fake news organisations to this sort of technology is to try and drown out content that has been verified using tools like this. And therefore, it's important that users get a fair chance to see content that has been verified and has information attached to it that can help them make their own mind up whether they trust it or not, and that content is seen by people.
Yeah, I think
exactly.
When you think about people gaming the system as well, I think as a result of the way in which a lot of platforms are set up to prioritize engagement and viral content over credible content, you do have bad actors who see this as a business opportunity and know that if they write an outrageous headline that gets more traffic than any credible news source, that they'll make money through advertising. So one of the things that we do is we try to work with brands and advertising agencies to drive revenue away from purveyors of misinformation and towards credible news sources. But of course, any lasting change will only come when the big advertising exchanges, like the ones run by Google, decide to do a better job of filtering out some of those bad actors from those ecosystems. Because as long as they're allowed in, you're essentially facilitating a market for people who take advantage of people's fears around something like COVID-19 in order to make a lot of money. And you see that big brands inadvertently end up funding those types of misinformation. I mean, we identified the US Health Authority, the CDC, and Pfizer as companies that inadvertently were funding COVID-19 vaccine misinformation over the last year.
Yeah, and I think that's really important work, and it's good to see advertisers engaging more on that issue and demanding that their advertising isn't placed against content that is harmful and misleading and would cause them reputational damage for them to be seen there.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, Sophie, Anna-Sophie, the idea here again that there can be verifiable sort of origin information, I think, perhaps best embodied in the Starling Reuters project we mentioned earlier. There is, take a look at the US election and the days leading up to Joe Biden's inauguration, plenty of misinformation, a fraught set of stories that plenty of disinformation purveyors trafficked in. But there is this 78 Days project, for example, that was generated by Reuters photographers that chronicle the 78 days leading up to Joe Biden's inauguration. And there would be plenty of opportunity to run ads against that, right? So if you're interested in this topic and tolerant or looking for truth, there are lots of opportunities and eyeballs to be had there. Optimistically, I think, without resorting to promoting disinformation or misinformation or unverified, inauthentic content. So if you look at that project, you can see that the idea that understanding and transparency about the camera that was used, where the images were taken, the location of the photographer, and even a blockchain underwriting the trust model there does give those images a level of veracity that disinformation campaigns would not have. And I'd like to think that advertisers can, profit from the number of eyeballs that would be directed to verified, true news data rather than being shunted off to disinformation sites. But it's early to say that. That is what we hope will happen as these standards take effect and are widely adopted. But again, this involves platform involvement as well as technology.
Yeah, I'd recommend people have a look at the Starling Reuters project online if they've not. And I thought it was even interesting to look at where you could map where people were, where pictures were taken in relation to physical locations around the Capitol building.
Right, and I've been told and involved in many conversations where folks lament the fact that this technology did not exist during the controversy around the number of attendees at Trump's inauguration versus the number of attendees at Barack Obama's inauguration, sort of underwritten by some images that were falsely cropped, incorrectly described, miscontextualized, all those kinds of things. And in fact, had this existed at the time of Trump's inauguration, I think that controversy would have been much less fraught and newsworthy than it was, and that's the future we envision. And as I said earlier, we think it's a near future, like the next few years, where that kind of transparency can be available to fact checkers, news organizations, photographers themselves, and of course consumers.
That's great, Andy and Anna-Sophie. It's been really great to have you on the podcast and to talk about the work that you're doing at Adobe and NewsGuard to try and create the tools we need to navigate our way through the maze of disinformation online. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Damian. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Damian.
I'd like to bring Charles Creel into the conversation now. Charles, it's great to have you with us here again. I know you've been looking once again at the serious issue of medical disinformation and COVID.
Thanks, Damian. In the U.S., officials at the National Institute of Health have turned up some worrying data that shows that women, and specifically healthcare workers, are giving the COVID vaccine a pass, and that this is largely due to a disinformation campaign from an unknown source. The Washington Post has quoted Frances Cullen, who's the director of the National Institute of Health, saying, quote, "There are stories out there on the internet about how vaccination can lead to infertility. There's absolutely nothing to that, but when we look at people who are expressing hesitancy, in many instances, those are women of childbearing age." Now, government officials have encountered huge hesitancy among Black and Hispanic adults to get the vaccine, but now they are finding that it's particularly bad amongst women in their 20s and 30s. These women represent a disproportionately large part of the healthcare workforce, and as a result, vaccine uptake at nursing homes and at hospitals has been as low as 20 to 50% in some places, and that's wildly below the 70 to 85% targets of the U.S. government. This also comes on the back of a few national surveys that show Americans surprisingly reluctant to get the jab. A Kaiser Family Foundation report found that 40% of people said in January that they would get it as soon as they could, and the Post is reporting this as good news because the figure is up from 34% in December. To my mind, 1/3 seems like a surprisingly low figure for the number of folks who might want to get a vaccine. But it turns out American women are more likely than men to turn down the shots, and they are especially worried about long-term side effects, with nearly 3/4 saying that they were very or somewhat concerned, and 12% of those surveyed said they had heard the vaccine caused infertility. Now, this has been completely debunked, to be sure, but it looks like it will create real headaches, not only in the U.S., but around the world in the battle against COVID. I mean, disinformation is just as international as the disease and the fight against it. Damian?
Thanks so much for that, Charles. Great to have you with us. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Andy Parsons, Anna-Sophie Harling, and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all proceeds will go towards the making of this podcast. Thank you. Until next time.